The village sits tucked between dark mountains and dense forest, stone houses lined along a narrow path, candlelight flickering behind small windows as night settles in. A sudden low hum rises from beneath the ground, steady and vibrating through the streets, while dogs bark sharply in the distance and then fall silent. Wind surges through the trees with unnatural force, shaking wooden doors and rattling roof beams. A piercing shriek slices across the valley, echoing from the forest line, and every light in the village seems to hesitate for a split second. Then everything stops. No wind, no sound, only a still village under an empty sky. The village was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world outside had forgotten it. Tucked away in the folds of a distant mountain range, it was a place so secluded that time seemed to pass differently there. The roads leading in were narrow and often lost in the dense trees, with only a few small paths connecting it to the outside world. Its residents were few in number but deeply connected to each other, bound by shared histories and generations of familial ties. The homes were modest, built from stone and wood, their foundations set deep in the earth, holding the weight of centuries of tradition. On the surface, it was the kind of place you'd imagine when you thought of old-world simplicity. A village untouched by the chaos of the world beyond, where everyone knew everyone else, and the harsh realities of the outside world felt like distant whispers. The rhythm of life moved at its own pace, dictated by the seasons and the work required to survive in such an isolated location. But there was a peculiar sense of calm that hung over the place, a stillness that many of the villagers themselves never fully understood. It wasn't the quiet of peace, it was the quiet of something waiting, something watching, something that didn't belong. Even the oldest residents of the village could recall strange stories, passed down through generations, of odd occurrences, glowing lights in the woods, strange sounds in the middle of the night, unexplained shapes seen in the distance, and stories of a time long ago when something terrible had happened to the village. But such tales were nothing more than old legends, relics of a time when fear and superstition were the only tools to explain the unknown. No one spoke much about the events of that night, the night that changed everything. In fact, no one really knew where to begin. It was as if the story had no start, no middle, no finish. It had simply happened. One moment, everything was as it should be, and the next, the village was gone. It all began on a night like any other. The villagers had no reason to suspect that anything out of the ordinary would occur. The evening sky had darkened earlier than usual, and the wind picked up, rustling the trees that surrounded the village like a protective barrier. The sun had long since dipped behind the horizon, and the air had turned colder, the crispness of autumn settling in. People went about their usual routines, lighting their homes with candles and gathering around the fire to share a meal, just as they always had. There was nothing to suggest that this night would be anything different. But then the sounds began. At first it was faint, a strange noise on the wind. A low hum that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. It wasn't like any sound they had ever heard before. The animals, usually so responsive to changes in the atmosphere, seemed unusually still. Dogs barked in the distance, but their barks were erratic, as though they were trying to warn the villagers of something they couldn't comprehend. The wind picked up, howling through the trees with an unnatural intensity, shaking the very foundations of the homes. And then it came. A shriek, high-pitched, terrifying, split the night, sending a chill through every single soul in the village. Some of the older residents who had lived there for decades froze in place. It wasn't the kind of scream that someone would make in distress or pain. It was something worse, something primal, something that reached deep into the heart of every living thing and made it shiver with fear. For a brief moment there was silence. Then it was as if the entire world had shifted. The ground shook slightly as though something heavy had moved beneath them. And the air itself seemed to crackle with an energy that was both foreign and menacing. The villagers, though frightened, didn't panic immediately. They had lived through storms and strange occurrences before, but nothing like this. The men and women gathered together in their homes, securing doors and windows, but it was clear that none of them knew exactly what was happening. Was it an earthquake? A storm? A wild animal? But no, it didn't feel like any of those things. It was something else. Something darker. Something unknown. Minutes turned into hours, but the terror didn't subside. If anything, it grew more intense. It was as if the very fabric of reality had begun to tear apart. As midnight approached, the noises became louder, more distinct. A sound like heavy footsteps moved through the forest outside the village, followed by an eerie, rhythmic thumping. It was as though something massive was approaching. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The wind calmed. The trees stopped rustling. The air became still. The village, which had been alive with the sound of terror just moments before, was now as quiet as it had ever been. But it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was an unsettling silence, thick with the weight of something unspeakable. The next morning the village was empty. When the first of the search parties arrived, they found nothing. Homes stood untouched, as if the villagers had simply walked out and never returned. The dinner tables were set, the fire still smoldering, but no one was there. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of violence, just emptiness. Even the dogs that had barked so frantically the night before were gone, as if they too had vanished into the air. The investigators that came in after the first wave of searchers were equally baffled. They combed through the village, looking for any clues, any sign of what had happened. No one could explain the emptiness. It was as though the entire village had simply erased itself, as if it had never existed at all. There were no footprints leading out of the village. No signs of any kind of evacuation. No luggage left behind, no personal items. It was as if, in the span of one night, the entire village had simply ceased to be. As the authorities tried to piece together the mystery, they realized there were more questions than answers. Where had the people gone? Why had they left in the middle of the night? Who or what could have caused the disappearance of an entire village without a trace? There were rumors, of course, whispers that the village had been cursed. Some said it had been marked by the very earth beneath it, others that it was the work of supernatural forces. A few believed that the villagers had been involved in something so dark, so dangerous, that it had caused them to flee in fear of their own lives. But no matter how much they speculated, the truth remained elusive. The village, it seemed, had vanished without a trace. No answers. No survivors. And no explanation. As the years passed, the village faded into legend, a dark mystery that no one could solve. Those who had dared to look for the truth had either disappeared themselves or found themselves tormented by the memories of what they had uncovered. And yet, the question still lingered. What happened to the village that night? What was the true nature of the terror that had caused its erasure? And most haunting of all, why had no one ever returned? The village, it seemed, had erased itself. And in doing so, it had left behind a trail of unanswered questions, of chilling memories, and a legacy of fear that would haunt those who sought the truth for years to come. The village, before that fateful night, had seemed like a sanctuary, a place where time moved at its own pace, sheltered by towering mountains and thick forests. It had been there for generations, a small dot on the map of a forgotten world. The residents led simple lives, waking with the dawn to tend their fields, milk the cows, or fix the fences. Days passed slowly, each one mirroring the one before it. But in its simplicity, there was a richness, a depth that came from years of tradition, from the bonds between families, and from the unspoken understanding that this place, though isolated, was theirs. The villagers were a mix of old and young, a reflection of the cycles of life that had been happening in the same place for centuries. There were the elders who knew every stone in the valley, who could recall tales of their ancestors and the hardships they endured. Their faces were weathered, their eyes sharp despite their age, and their hands had known years of labor. Then there were the younger ones, bright-eyed children who ran barefoot in the streets, their laughter echoing in the wind, and young couples who dreamed of building a future in the village, far removed from the chaos of the modern world. There was no rushing. No need for haste. Everyone had their role, and life moved steadily along its well-worn path. The village was known for its harmony with nature. The fields surrounding it yielded the fruits and vegetables necessary for the villagers to sustain themselves through the changing seasons. The mountain streams ran clean and pure, providing them with fresh water. The village was self-sufficient, not relying on the outside world for anything other than the occasional visit to the neighboring towns. There was a certain peace in that, a reassurance that no matter what happened, they would always have each other and the land to lean on. But beneath the surface, there were murmurs, whispers that the village was not entirely as peaceful as it appeared. These whispers often came in hushed tones, spoken by those who had lived in the village long enough to understand the strange history of the place. There were stories of inexplicable occurrences, things that couldn't easily be explained away, even by the most logical minds. The elders spoke of strange lights that had been seen dancing over the treetops, flickering like fireflies, yet moving in unnatural patterns. The woods surrounding the village, thick and dark, were said to harbor something ancient, something that had been there long before the village was founded. A sense of being watched, of being followed, had haunted many of the villagers for as long as anyone could remember. Perhaps the most chilling stories were the ones that no one truly spoke about. The village had always been a place of quiet, steadfast loyalty to tradition, but there were moments when the village seemed to forget itself, when its people would gather in silence for no apparent reason, when the air would grow thick with tension. The youngest members of the village, those who had never known anything but this place, would sometimes say that there was a part of the village, something in the earth or in the wind, that felt alive as if it had a memory of its own. But those words were rarely spoken aloud, for fear of stirring up something that could not be put back to rest. Yet, for the most part, life in the village continued unbroken. The day would arrive, and with it, the daily chores. The farmers in the fields, the women in the kitchens, the children in the schoolhouse. They all went about their tasks, their lives a simple reflection of the seasons. But there were those who couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. These were the ones who had lived long enough to know that nothing in the world, no matter how peaceful, could last forever. The elders, though they often spoke little, sometimes gave warnings. They spoke in riddles or half-spoken truths, warning the younger generation to be wary of the mountain winds, to never venture too deep into the woods, and to always be on guard during the autumn months, when the air grew thick with mystery. For there was something ancient in those woods, something older than the village itself, something that had watched over this land for as long as the mountains had stood. But as with all warnings, they were often ignored. The younger villagers, in their eagerness to explore and experience life, would dismiss these stories as mere superstition, relics of a time when the unknown was feared more than it was understood. They thought themselves beyond such things, their minds sharpened by the knowledge of the outside world. They believed that the strange happenings, the whispers, were nothing more than the product of old minds, too steeped in their own traditions to see things for what they were. Perhaps the most striking thing about the village was the way it seemed to turn inward, the way it shut itself off from the rest of the world. No one really questioned it. It was simply the way things were. It was a place where the outside world was seen as a distant, sometimes dangerous place, full of the unknown. The villagers were content in their isolation, knowing that they could rely on each other for everything they needed. The idea of something coming from the outside, something that could disturb the delicate balance of their lives, was almost unthinkable. And yet, even in this peaceful, isolated corner of the world, change was inevitable. The first sign of it came quietly, in the form of strange occurrences that the villagers couldn't explain away. At first, it was just odd things, things that were easy to dismiss as coincidences. The old woman who swore she saw a shadow move in the corner of her room at night. The sudden appearance of strange symbols carved into the trees at the edge of the woods. The strange weather patterns that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Storms that rolled in faster than they should have, thunder that rattled the windows, lightning that cracked the sky in unnatural colors. These things, small as they were, began to pile up. They became harder to ignore. And with each passing day, the tension in the village grew. There was an undercurrent of unease that no one could quite put their finger on. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something deeper, more unsettling, a sense that something was about to happen, something that could not be avoided. The very air in the village seemed to thrum with this unspoken anticipation. Even the children felt it. They didn't understand the specifics, but they knew something was off. They stopped playing in the woods as much as they used to, looking over their shoulders more often than not, their imaginations filled with shadows. And the adults, who had lived through much in their time, found themselves strangely anxious, constantly looking toward the horizon as though waiting for something, or someone, to appear. But what exactly was coming, no one knew. The feeling spread like wildfire, infecting even the most logical minds. And as the days grew shorter, as the winds began to shift with the changing of the seasons, it became clear that the village was on the cusp of something that none of them were prepared for. There were no signs, no warnings. It came without a single whisper, a single hint of what was to come. And when the night finally arrived, everything changed. Just as the villagers had always feared, something unknown came to claim the village, something that had always been there, waiting. The silence of the night was the last they would ever know. The village, so long a place of peace, was about to erase itself from the world forever. The night had begun like any other. There was nothing to suggest that it would turn into the kind of terror that would haunt the minds of anyone who survived it for years to come. The evening had settled in as it always did, with a chill that swept through the village as the sun dipped below the horizon. The wind had picked up a bit, rustling the leaves of the trees that surrounded the village, and the last of the day's light had dimmed into a cold, inky black. It was a night of deep shadows, one where the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of the unseen. Inside the homes, people went about their usual evening routines. The faint flicker of candlelight cast long shadows across the walls, and the smell of roasting meats and simmering stews filled the air. The sound of clinking dishes, soft conversations, and the crackling of fires were all that could be heard. The night was peaceful, almost too peaceful. No one noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere, how the air seemed to grow colder, how the wind began to howl more insistently. It wasn't the kind of wind that would make you pause. It was the kind of wind that was too loud, too constant, too unnerving. At first, no one really noticed it, not in any significant way. It was only later, when the terror had begun to unfold, that people would look back and say that it had all started with that slight, imperceptible change in the wind. The subtle warning that none of them had heeded. And then suddenly a scream cut through the night. It wasn't like any scream that had been heard in the village before. It was raw and wild, filled with the kind of terror that seemed to crack the very air itself. The kind of scream that sent shockwaves of fear through every person who heard it. It came from the woods, distant yet piercing, echoing across the valley in a way that seemed to twist the very fabric of reality. It was a scream that reached into the deepest part of the human soul and made it shudder in pure dread. And it didn't stop. At first there was confusion. People looked at each other, wondering if they had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't the kind of scream made by a person in distress. It was something else, something far more primal, something that seemed to speak of a kind of suffering that couldn't be borne by the human mind. And then came the other sounds. A low, resonant hum, like the deep vibrating of the earth itself. It came from beneath their feet, a sound so deep, so unsettling, that it felt like it was resonating in the bones of everyone who heard it. At first no one moved. They couldn't. They didn't know what to do. The terror was too sudden, too strange. But then one by one they began to stir. The fear was palpable, heavy in the air. People gathered together in their homes, bolting doors and shuttering windows. Some of them began to pray, others paced restlessly, unsure of what to do next. There was no guidance, no way of understanding what was happening. The village had never seen anything like this, and the people, for all their years of living close to nature, knew nothing of this kind of terror. The wind had become deafening now. It howled through the trees, whipping the branches into a frenzy. The earth beneath their feet seemed to tremble in response, as if it was alive, as if it was warning them, urging them to flee. But flee where? There was nowhere to go. The village was surrounded by mountains on all sides, and there was no safe place beyond them. The only escape was the one thing none of them dared to consider, the dark, unknowable night that had already claimed so much of their peace. As the minutes ticked by, the sounds grew more intense, more chaotic. The hum deepened, as though it were rising from the very core of the earth itself. And then, something began to move in the woods. Shapes, shadows, figures that seemed to glide through the trees, too quick to be seen clearly but too real to be ignored. They moved with an unnatural speed, with an eerie grace that made them seem as though they weren't bound by the same laws of nature as the rest of the world. Some of the villagers, trembling with fear, looked out their windows into the darkness. What they saw froze them in their tracks. In the distance there was movement, figures humanoid yet not. They were tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch and sway unnaturally with the wind. The figures were draped in shadows, their faces hidden, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was as though they weren't truly of this world at all. They didn't belong here. The terror escalated. Screams echoed through the village once more, but these screams were different. These were screams of horror, of pain. They came from the direction of the forest. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the screams stopped. The silence that followed was worse than anything the villagers could have imagined. It was a stillness so deep, so profound, that it felt as if the world itself had ceased to exist. The village, once so alive with the sounds of daily life, was now an empty shell. Nothing moved. No animals dared to stir. The trees seemed to stand in frozen silence, their branches hanging heavy with the weight of something unspoken. Then the earth itself began to shake. It wasn't a violent tremor, but rather a low, unsettling rumble, like the sound of something massive moving beneath the ground. It was as though the very foundation of the earth was shifting, as though something was coming to the surface. The villagers were paralyzed with fear. No one knew what was happening. No one could explain it. All they could do was stand in their homes, staring into the night, waiting for the unknown to reveal itself. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The wind ceased its howling. The ground stopped shaking. The eerie hum faded into silence. But the damage had already been done. The village, once so full of life, was now eerily empty. The homes stood still, the doors ajar, the hearts cold, and the air thick with the lingering scent of terror. It was as though the village had been abandoned in the span of a few minutes, as though it had been erased from existence. No one could explain what had happened that night. The few who survived would later recount their experiences in fragmented, terrified whispers, but none of them would ever be able to tell the full story. The events of that night were beyond comprehension, beyond anything their minds could process. It was as though the village had been caught in the grip of something far more powerful, far more ancient, than any of them could understand. And when it was over, when the dust had settled and the world had gone quiet again, the village was no more. The people were gone. The houses were empty. And the terror lingered, a shadow that would never fully dissipate. It had come from the woods, from the earth, from a place unknown, and in the span of a single night, it had erased the village from existence. And when the morning light came, the village was gone, vanished, as though it had never been there at all. The only traces left behind were the whispers of the survivors and the unanswered questions that would haunt anyone who dared to search for the truth. The terror had come and gone, but its mark had been left on the land forever. The village, and the people who had lived there, had disappeared into the night, leaving nothing but the memory of something that was never meant to be understood. The morning after the disappearance was one of unnatural stillness. It wasn't the calm that follows a storm, nor was it the kind of quiet one might expect from a world at rest. No, this was different. This was an absence so profound that it seemed to permeate the air itself. The village, which had only hours earlier been full of life, was now completely devoid of it. There were no footsteps on the gravel paths, no voices calling to one another, no animals stirring in the barns or fields. The silence was suffocating, unnerving, and all the more unnatural because it was so complete. It was the absence of life that haunted the investigators first. They arrived later in the morning, after the first search party had made the grisly discovery. There had been no warning. The villagers had vanished, just gone as though they had simply walked away and never returned. The streets were eerily empty, save for the abandoned houses that stood like hollow shells, their windows dark, their doors left ajar. The houses, their structures solid and well-kept, betrayed no signs of struggle or distress. Everything appeared as though it had been frozen in time, as if the villagers had only just stepped out to gather wood or water and would be back any minute. But as the investigators moved through the village, looking at the small details that should have told them something, anything, about the events of the previous night, they found nothing to explain the mystery. There were no signs of violence, no evidence that anyone had been taken against their will. The beds were unmade, and in some houses the evening meals were still warm, untouched. The smell of freshly baked bread still lingered in the air in one of the cottages. There were even the half-filled mugs of tea left on the tables, as if the villagers had just put down their cups and left. But where had they gone? Some investigators speculated that the villagers had simply left. Maybe they had fled the village in a panic, abandoning their homes in haste. But no one could explain why. What could possibly have caused such a sudden and complete exodus? There were no signs of an external threat, no invaders, no sign of an attack. Nothing was missing from the houses, no valuables taken. The village was left untouched, as if the people had simply ceased to exist. Then the searchers discovered something even more unsettling. There were no footprints leading out of the village. There was no evidence to suggest that anyone had left on foot, not a single print in the mud or on the dirt roads. How could that be? The ground was soft in places and it rained the night before. If anyone had left in a hurry, there would surely be some trace, some sign, of their departure. Yet there was nothing. The village was a ghost town, and the only thing that remained was the eerie silence and the lingering sense that something was deeply, inexplicably wrong. The most unnerving discovery came when the searchers entered the woods just beyond the village. The trees stood tall, their branches swaying in the wind, but everything within the forest seemed strangely still. The further they ventured into the woods, the more intense the silence became. No birds chirped, no animals rustled in the underbrush. It was as though the very life of the forest had been drained away. But what they found in the depths of the woods was even more horrifying. There, amidst the thick trees, was a small clearing. And in that clearing, there was something that no one had expected to find: the remnants of a fire. It had clearly been burning just hours earlier. The remains of charred logs were scattered around, their blackened edges still smoking faintly. The air smelled faintly of ash and smoke, as though the fire had just been abandoned. But there was no sign of any people. The fire had been left burning, the ashes still warm, as though someone had simply walked away in the middle of the night without a word. It was as though the village had vanished in an instant, leaving behind only traces of the life that had been. There was no sign of a struggle, no trace of any violent altercation. The villagers had just disappeared, gone without a trace, leaving nothing but the eerie remnants of their lives behind. It was as if they had never existed at all. As the days turned into weeks, the mystery of the vanished village deepened. No one could explain what had happened. The authorities were at a loss, and no one in the nearby towns had any answers. The investigation stalled, and the people who had been most affected by the disappearance, those who had lived nearby or had family in the village, were left to wrestle with the terrifying uncertainty that hung over everything. Some believed the villagers had been taken by something supernatural. Others thought it was the result of some hidden government experiment or some kind of secret military operation. But there was no evidence to support any of these theories. The survivors, the few who had been outside the village at the time, could offer little more than fragments of information. Some claimed to have seen strange lights in the sky that night. Others spoke of hearing eerie sounds in the distance, voices calling out in the night, but no one could be sure where they came from. No one could piece together what had happened. Over time, the village itself became a place of fear, a cursed location that no one dared approach. The government deemed the area a no-go zone, forbidding any further investigations. The land was left to reclaim itself, the buildings slowly decaying and falling into ruin. But the mystery of what had happened that night never left the minds of those who had known the village. It lingered in their thoughts, haunting them with unanswered questions and unsettling possibilities. Some of the survivors would go on to live long, quiet lives, but the memory of that night never truly left them. They couldn't shake the images of the empty houses, the untouched meals, the fire still burning in the woods. They were haunted by the knowledge that something dark and unknowable had taken the village. But no one could understand what that something was. And as the years passed, the mystery deepened, leaving only more questions in its wake. As for the village itself, it was swallowed up by the passage of time. The houses fell into ruin, the land was reclaimed by the forest, and the stories of the vanished people faded into the background of local folklore. But for those who remembered, who still felt the chill of that night in their bones, the mystery was far from over. What had really happened? Where had the villagers gone? And why had they never returned? The answers, if they ever existed, seemed to have been lost with the village. And as the years turned to decades, the mystery of the vanished village became just that, a mystery, a shadow hanging over the land, a question that no one could answer. Yet it lingered in the hushed whispers of those who still remembered, in the eerie quiet of the abandoned land, and in the memories of those who dared to ask the question, what happened to the village that vanished overnight? In the wake of the village's disappearance, a sense of chaos and confusion spread throughout the nearby towns. News of the event traveled quickly, though not in the way one might expect. No official explanation was given. No reports were made that could give any semblance of order to what had occurred. The authorities seemed reluctant to speak about it, as if they themselves didn't fully understand what had happened. For the people living in nearby villages, the news was just as bewildering as it was terrifying. The village had simply vanished and no one knew why or how. The very idea of it seemed to challenge the natural order of things. Initially, local law enforcement and government officials worked together, sending in search parties to look for survivors or any clues that might explain the mass disappearance. But when they arrived in the village, they found only silence and desolation. The absence of evidence, the untouched homes, the strange absence of any sign of struggle, all of it pointed to something far beyond their understanding. The search efforts turned up no bodies, no remnants of any violent event, no suggestion of a natural disaster. It was as if the entire population had simply ceased to exist in an instant. The homes were left exactly as they had been, with no signs of distress, no signs of a hasty departure. The fire still burned in the clearing as though waiting for someone to tend it. The only thing that was unmistakable was the emptiness, the stillness that enveloped everything. As the investigation continued, a few of the survivors who had been outside the village that night were located, though they were few in number. Most of them had heard the rumors and stories about the village but had remained outside of it for their own reasons. Some had been away at the time of the incident. Others had simply been too far from the village to return when the events unfolded. But all of them shared one thing in common. None of them knew what had happened. They spoke, though reluctantly, of strange occurrences. A few of them recalled hearing strange noises that night, the unsettling hum that had vibrated through the ground. Some mentioned fleeting figures in the distance, shadows moving too quickly to be human, figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. There were reports of lights in the sky, lights that had danced in the clouds, moving in ways that defied natural explanation. But none of the survivors could offer any solid answers. They spoke of dread and confusion, of a terror so deep that it left them speechless, struggling to explain what they had felt, what they had witnessed. The investigators, however, were not so easily dissuaded. Theories began to form, some grounded in natural explanations, others veering into the realms of the supernatural. Some believed it could have been a mass hysteria incident, that the villagers had succumbed to some kind of shared psychosis. Others considered the possibility of a chemical leak, some kind of toxin that had affected the villagers, causing them to flee or even to lose their minds. But none of these theories accounted for the complete and utter disappearance of the village, the total lack of any physical evidence, and the eerie calm that followed. There were no signs of a gas leak or contamination. There were no footprints, no trails to follow, no wreckage left behind. It was as if the village had simply vanished. Other theories emerged that were far more unsettling. There were whispers of ancient curses, of something that had been awakened by the villagers' presence, a force that had come to reclaim what was once its own. The village, it was said, had been built on land that had been sacred long ago, and perhaps the villagers had unknowingly disturbed something that should have been left undisturbed. Stories surfaced about strange rituals that had been performed in the past, about old legends of the forest and the mountains that bordered the village. These were stories of dark, malevolent forces, of beings that lived beneath the earth or in the hidden places of the world, waiting for the right moment to rise and reclaim their domain. Some even speculated that the villagers had been taken either by these forces or by something else, something that existed outside the boundaries of normal reality. As weeks turned into months, the investigation slowed. Theories ran their course, and as quickly as they had begun, they fizzled out. The village remained empty, an eerie reminder of something terrible, something that no one could understand. The authorities made attempts to control the story, but no one could stop the rumors from spreading. The surrounding villages grew wary, and soon, people began to avoid the area altogether. The land, it seemed, had become cursed, and no one wanted to risk discovering what lay beneath that heavy silence. Despite the lack of official answers, the village's disappearance became a topic of much debate among the public. Journalists began to write about it, though none could find the words to truly capture the depth of the mystery. Theories continued to evolve, some grounded in reality, others far more fantastic. But the truth, the real explanation, was nowhere to be found. The authorities seemed reluctant to discuss the matter any further, and over time the media lost interest. Other stories began to take precedence, and the mystery of the vanished village became just another unsolved case in the annals of history. But the haunting nature of the disappearance lingered. Over time, the villagers, who had once been so vibrant, so full of life, became little more than shadows in the minds of the surrounding communities. Their disappearance became legend, whispers of a town that had simply vanished, a ghost town with no trace of what had happened. The land where the village once stood was left to slowly decay, the houses slowly rotting away, the fields overtaken by weeds. The memories of those who had lived there faded, their names lost to time. But for some, the story never really ended. A few continued to search for answers, even though the search had long since been deemed futile. Some of the survivors still spoke of that night, still spoke of the terror they had felt, though their words were often cryptic, as though they were trying to make sense of something that could never be fully understood. There were always those who believed that the village's disappearance was part of something larger, something far beyond their comprehension. They believed that the mystery would one day be solved, that the truth would eventually come to light, though no one could say when. The investigation had stalled, and with it, the public's interest. But the mystery still held a grip on those who dared to ask questions. Over time, some of the original investigators had abandoned their pursuit, while others had been transferred to different cases. Still, there were always whispers that the truth was out there waiting to be uncovered. Perhaps, in time, someone would find the answers. But for now, the village remained a shadow, a story that would never quite be finished, never quite be explained. And yet, despite the passing years, despite the increasing decay of the village and the fading memories of its inhabitants, the question still lingered. What happened that night? Why had the village disappeared, and where had its people gone? These questions, though they may never be answered, remained the one constant in the haunting tale of the village that vanished without a trace. The answers, if they existed, were buried somewhere deep within the land, hidden by the forces that had taken the village, lost to history, waiting to be uncovered. But until then, the mystery remained, unresolved, unanswered, and eternal. In the years that followed the disappearance, the legend of the vanished village grew. The people who had once lived there became figures of mystery, their faces lost to time but their stories alive in whispers. It was as if the village had become a part of folklore, a tale told around campfires, at the dinner table, in hushed conversations. There was something both terrifying and fascinating about it. The very idea of an entire village vanishing in the dead of night, without a trace, was a haunting thought that refused to let go. The unanswered questions gnawed at the minds of those who dared to ponder them. What had really happened? Why had the village disappeared? Where had the people gone? Despite the absence of concrete answers, some people believed they could feel a presence in the place where the village had once stood. There were stories of people who had ventured too close to the area, people who claimed to have felt an overwhelming sense of dread the moment they stepped foot on the land. Some spoke of a chill that crept over them, a sudden weight on their chest, as if the very air had become thicker and harder to breathe. Others claimed to have heard strange sounds, whispers carried on the wind, low murmurings that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth. It was as though the land itself held secrets and it wasn't eager to let them go. Though the authorities had declared the area off-limits, there were always those brave, or foolish, enough to venture close. They would tell stories of strange happenings, of lights in the sky, of shadows moving in the woods, but none of them could explain it. And perhaps, deep down, no one truly wanted to. The mystery, after all, was what made it so compelling. Without the mystery, without the unanswered questions, it would be just another forgotten place in a world full of forgotten things. But what if there was something to those stories? What if the land had been cursed? There were those who believed that the villagers had unknowingly disturbed something ancient, something that had always lived there in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The village, after all, had stood for generations. Its people had worked the land, built homes, and lived their lives without realizing that they were on sacred ground, ground that was never meant to be disturbed. It was easy to imagine that the land, or the forces that inhabited it, had grown restless, and that the events of that night were its way of reclaiming what had been taken from it. Some of the old-timers who still lived in the nearby towns whispered about an ancient ritual that had been performed long before the village was founded. They spoke of a time when the mountains were believed to be the home of spirits, of beings that lived beneath the earth and in the shadows of the trees. According to these stories, there were ancient rites performed by the people who once lived in the region, rites that were meant to appease the spirits, to ensure the safety of those who lived on the land. Over the years, the knowledge of these rites had faded, lost to time. But perhaps the old-timers reasoned the land had not forgotten. Perhaps the disappearance of the village was the result of something ancient, something that had been awakened when the villagers unknowingly disturbed the land that was never meant to be touched. The idea of an ancient curse was one that had been discussed for years. Those who believed in it pointed to the strange occurrences that had plagued the village long before the night of its disappearance. The glowing lights in the woods, the strange sounds that echoed through the trees, the unnerving feeling that something was always watching. All of these were said to be signs that the village had been marked, that the spirits or forces of the land were sending warnings to the people who lived there. And yet, the villagers had ignored these signs, dismissing them as mere superstition, until it was too late. As the years passed, the mystery of the village continued to haunt those who lived in the surrounding areas. It became a part of local legend, passed down from generation to generation. There were always stories, tales of travelers who had ventured too close to the village site and had disappeared, of strange figures seen at night, of whispers carried on the wind. But as time wore on, these stories grew more and more distorted, more fantastical. Some claimed that the village had been taken by extraterrestrials, that the people had been abducted by beings from another world. Others speculated that the villagers had become victims of a government experiment gone wrong. The theories were endless, but the one thing that remained constant was the uncertainty, the knowledge that the truth had never been revealed. The area where the village had once stood became a place of dark fascination. People from far and wide came to catch a glimpse of the desolate land, to feel the eerie stillness that hung over the place. There were always those who were willing to risk everything for a chance to uncover the truth. But each time they came, they left empty-handed. Some returned with wild stories, stories of strange lights in the sky, of figures that moved in the shadows, but no one could provide evidence, no one could give a clear explanation. The village, it seemed, had become a part of the land itself, its mystery a permanent fixture in the landscape. But the desire to solve the mystery never faded. There were always those who believed that the truth could still be uncovered, that the land still held the answers. And so, from time to time, a new investigator, a new team of scientists, or even a curious group of thrill-seekers would arrive, hoping to find something that had been overlooked, something that could explain what had happened. They would venture into the woods, search the ruins of the village, and conduct their investigations. But always they would leave with more questions than answers. The local authorities, of course, had long since given up on finding an answer. They had closed the case, declared it an unsolved mystery, and turned their attention elsewhere. But for those who had once lived in the area, the memory of that night lingered in the corners of their minds. Some of them had moved away, unable to live with the unanswered questions. Others remained, though they never spoke of the village's disappearance. It was as if they were afraid to even acknowledge it, as if doing so would somehow invite the darkness back into their lives. But there were still those who kept the story alive, those who were determined to find the answers. The disappearance of the village had become an obsession for some, a mystery they could not let go of, a riddle that demanded to be solved. They scoured old records, combed through ancient texts, and searched for any clue that might lead them to the truth. They talked to anyone who might have known something, hoping for a scrap of information that could help them piece together the puzzle. And though they found little, they refused to give up. For some, the village's disappearance had become more than just a mystery. It had become a calling, a quest to uncover something that no one else had been able to explain. The story of the vanished village continued to haunt the people of the region, though few dared to speak of it openly. It was as though the very act of acknowledging the mystery brought it closer, as if the answers were just out of reach, waiting to be uncovered. And so, the legend grew, fed by the whispers of those who dared to search for the truth, and by the quiet terror of those who had lived through the events and could never quite shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. Something that had once claimed the village and might one day return to claim something else. The mystery of the vanished village continued to haunt the nearby towns, becoming a subject of eerie fascination for those with a morbid curiosity and a desire to uncover the truth. But the story was more than just a haunting ghost tale for those who had lived near the village. For some, it was a deeply unsettling reminder of how little they really understood about the world around them. And for others, it became an obsession, an unshakable urge to solve a puzzle that had no clear pieces. As the years wore on, many tried to make sense of the inexplicable, and some even turned to paranormal investigations, convinced that the village's disappearance was not a product of a natural disaster or mass hysteria, but the work of something far darker. One group of investigators was a team of seasoned professionals, each specializing in different aspects of the unexplained. There was Dr. Harrison, a renowned anthropologist who had spent much of his career studying ancient civilizations and their mysterious rituals. He had heard the stories, of course, but it wasn't until he was approached by a small, private group of researchers that he truly considered the possibility of something supernatural at play. Along with him was Eva Sanchez, a paranormal expert who had worked on several high-profile cases, gaining a reputation for being able to detect and interpret the faintest signs of otherworldly activity. Then there was Mark Thompson, a retired police officer whose interest in the case had been piqued by the lack of any concrete evidence. He had worked on countless missing persons investigations throughout his career and found the mystery surrounding the village deeply perplexing. And finally, there was Olivia, an investigative journalist known for her tenacity and ability to get to the heart of a story no matter how dangerous or obscure it might be. Together, they formed a team determined to uncover the truth behind the village's disappearance. Their first journey to the area was nothing short of chilling. The landscape had changed over the years. Nature had reclaimed much of the land, with the once thriving village now almost entirely covered by dense trees and overgrown vines. But even in its decayed state, there was something unsettling about the place. It wasn't just the physical absence of the people, it was the weight of the silence that seemed to hang in the air. The atmosphere felt thick, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to return. The investigators arrived at the site on a crisp autumn morning. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was heavy, damp, and cold. As they stepped onto the land that had once been home to so many, there was a collective unease that settled over them. The team set up their base camp at the edge of the woods, just outside the boundary of the old village. Their plan was to spend several days combing through the area, taking measurements, collecting samples, and documenting any unusual activity that might point to an explanation for the mysterious events of that night. Dr. Harrison, with his knowledge of ancient rituals and the ways in which certain areas can be charged with unusual energy, took the lead in exploring the land. He was immediately struck by something unusual about the topography. The ground beneath his feet felt different, squishy, almost as if there was something buried below the surface. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but it felt like the earth was holding something down, something that was desperate to break free. This unsettling sensation, however, wasn't something he could explain scientifically. The feeling was vague but undeniable. It was as though the land itself was conscious of the presence of those who dared to trespass on it. Eva, the paranormal expert, was more concerned with the energy of the area. She carried a variety of specialized equipment designed to detect shifts in electromagnetic fields, temperature fluctuations, and other telltale signs of paranormal activity. As soon as they ventured deeper into the woods, she noticed that the readings on her equipment were erratic, jumping wildly from high to low, with no clear pattern. The temperature also seemed to fluctuate in strange bursts, dropping suddenly in some areas, rising in others. It wasn't just a variation of natural forces. It felt as if something unseen was manipulating the atmosphere, an energy that was neither natural nor explainable by conventional means. Eva also noticed an unsettling presence in the woods, an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on her chest the further they ventured. Her intuition told her that something malevolent was nearby, watching them from the shadows. Though she tried to maintain a professional demeanor, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed by something that didn't belong. Every time she looked around, she felt as though the trees were closing in on them, as if the forest itself was trying to swallow them whole. Meanwhile, Mark, the former police officer, had begun to piece together a theory based on the scant evidence they had gathered. He had spent years investigating missing persons cases, and in his experience, there were always clues, always signs of where people had gone, or at least where they had last been. But in the case of this village, there were no signs. No bodies, no footprints, no indication of where the villagers had gone. It was as if they had simply been erased. The houses had been left as they were, with no struggle, no sign of panic, just an eerie stillness. Mark began to question whether the people had even left at all. Could it be that they were taken, but taken in such a way that left no trace? Could something have happened to them that defied the laws of nature and left no physical evidence? Olivia, the journalist, was busy documenting everything, trying to uncover new angles and talking to the few locals who still remembered the village. But even the townspeople who had once known the villagers seemed reluctant to speak about it. They, too, had their theories, some as bizarre as the idea of alien abductions, others as simple as a mass migration out of fear. But no one could explain what had truly happened that night. Olivia's job was to dig deeper, to find the one piece of information that would unlock the mystery, but the more she searched, the more she realized that this was not a story that would be easily untangled. The investigators spent 3 days on the site, each day growing more and more frustrated as they uncovered little in the way of hard evidence. However, on the 4th day something happened that none of them could explain. Eva, while conducting a final sweep of the area with her equipment, began to pick up a strange signal, an unmistakable burst of energy, unlike anything she had ever seen. It came from deep within the woods, from a section of the land they had not yet explored. Eva was immediately drawn to it, and the rest of the team followed her as she led them toward the source. As they moved through the woods, the energy readings grew more intense. It felt as though the very ground was pulsing beneath their feet, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to sync with their heartbeats. The trees around them seemed to shift, and the air grew heavier with each step they took. When they finally reached the source of the disturbance, they found something truly disturbing. A large, circular stone structure hidden beneath layers of moss and dirt. It was partially buried in the earth, but the stone was unmistakable, a structure that seemed far older than the village itself. The stone had strange markings on it, symbols that none of the investigators could immediately identify. They were carved deeply into the surface, as if etched by an unknown hand. Some of the markings resembled ancient script, but they were unlike anything seen in any known civilization. Eva stepped forward, carefully running her fingers over the symbols, her eyes widening with realization. "This isn't just a structure," she whispered. "It's a boundary that's been broken." The air around them grew even heavier, and the temperature dropped dramatically. Mark, who had been standing a few feet back, suddenly felt a surge of cold energy run through him, sending a shiver down his spine. He looked at the others, his voice low. "We need to leave. This place is wrong." But before they could retreat, the ground beneath them trembled and a low, resonating hum filled the air. The vibration intensified, and then, without warning, the forest seemed to explode into activity. The trees creaked and groaned as though they were alive, and the once still air began to swirl around them, whipping into a frenzy. In that moment, the investigators realized they weren't alone. Something was here, something ancient and powerful that had been waiting, hidden beneath the surface, for someone to uncover it. And now, the boundaries that had kept it at bay were beginning to break. It was as though they had opened a door, one that had remained shut for centuries. And what had been locked away was now stirring, ready to reclaim its territory. The questions that had plagued the village's history, what had happened that night, now seemed secondary to a much darker, much more terrifying reality. The village had been erased, not by a natural disaster, but by forces far older and more malevolent than anyone could have imagined. And as the hum grew louder, the investigators realized that they might never leave this place, never find the answers they were searching for. The land itself was awakening, and they had disturbed it. The ground continued to tremble beneath the investigators' feet, and the air around them thickened, heavy with a force they couldn't fully comprehend. Eva, Mark, Dr. Harrison, and Olivia stood frozen, their senses overwhelmed by the palpable shift in the environment. The deep hum reverberated through the earth like the low rumble of a distant storm, and the trees around them seemed to sway in an unnatural rhythm, as if responding to the vibrations emanating from the ancient stone structure. The energy was undeniable, and it wasn't just unsettling, it was suffocating. The land was alive, and it was speaking in a language they could not understand. For a brief moment, the team stood motionless, each trying to process the impossible nature of what they were witnessing. The markings on the stone seemed to glow faintly, as if responding to their presence, to the very air they breathed. It was as though the stone itself was alive, an ancient artifact charged with some kind of power that had been dormant for centuries. Eva's fingers tingled where they had brushed against the carvings. She could feel something pulling at her, something deep within the earth, beckoning her to understand it, to unlock its secrets. She took a step back, her breath shaky, but the compulsion to uncover the truth remained. This is more than just a boundary, she said, her voice a whisper, barely audible over the humming sound that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. This is a door. Mark took a step back, instinctively reaching for his radio, his knuckles white around the transmitter. We need to get out of here, he said, his voice tight with tension. But as he turned to speak, the forest around them seemed to close in. The once peaceful surroundings had become a claustrophobic maze, as though the trees were shifting, subtly closing the paths they had traveled. He tried to take another step, but it was as though something invisible was holding him in place. The air grew colder, and then, without warning, a wind picked up, fierce and sudden, slashing through the trees and causing the branches to creak and groan. The hum intensified, a deep, almost deafening sound that rattled the air itself. The stone structure trembled, and the ground beneath them seemed to shift again, as though it was preparing to give way to something beneath. Dr. Harrison, the anthropologist, felt a sudden surge of dread wash over him. He had studied ancient civilizations and their rituals for years, but nothing in his academic career had prepared him for this. This wasn't just an archaeological site, it was something far older, far more mysterious. We need to leave. Whatever this is, it's not something we should be messing with, he said urgently, his voice betraying his professional composure. I don't know what's beneath us, but it's not natural. It's ancient. Olivia, ever the determined journalist, was now scrambling to document every moment, her camera rolling as she tried to capture everything. Her mind raced with the implications of what they had just discovered. The markings, the energy, the sudden change in the air, it all pointed to something far beyond any explanation. The village's disappearance, the eerie silence that had followed, the strange energy in the woods, all of it was tied together in some incomprehensible way, but how? And why? She turned the camera toward the stone structure, capturing the faint glow of the symbols etched into its surface. She couldn't help but think of the stories she had heard, the local legends about the spirits that lived in the mountains, the curses passed down through generations, the whispers of dark forces that had once been worshipped. Was it possible that all of this was real?